Hello and good evening. Welcome to all of our attendees tonight. My name is Jennifer Koopa Olsta, and I am a co-founder of Baybridge, as well as a faculty member at Medical College of Wisconsin and a provider at Children's Wisconsin. I'm so excited about our panel discussion tonight and the partnerships that have allowed us to host this presentation today. We thank the League, 371 Productions and Milwaukee Film for allowing us to view the film When Claude Got Shot. And to our co-sponsors of the panel, including Medical College of Wisconsin, Children's Wisconsin, Froedert Memorial Lutheran Hospital, and Moms Demand Action. As we begin the conversation this evening, I would like to review the components of our standard Baybridge Community Agreement. First, stay engaged. Remain morally, emotionally, intellectually, and socially involved in the dialogue. Expect and accept non-closure. Be prepared for uncertainty and do not attempt to rush to quick solutions. Be prepared to experience discomfort. Recognize that discomfort is inevitable, especially in conversations about race. And speak your truth. Use I statements when talking. You are the only person who has your unique experiences. With those expectations outlined, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce our panel moderator. Dr. Terry Darun-Cassini is an associate professor in the Department of Surgery, Division of Trauma and Critical Care at the Medical College of Wisconsin, as well as the director of the Comprehensive Injury Center. She is the medical director of the Trauma and Health Psychology program, where inpatient screening and intervention is provided to trauma patients, as well as outpatient integrative care. Dr. Darun-Cassini is the Director of Research for the Trauma Program and co-director of the Milwaukee Trauma Outcomes Project. Her research agenda includes neurobiopsychosocial phenotypes of psychopathology and resilience following trauma and understanding how socio-environmental stress, such as exposure to community violence, impacts one's biology and overall health. Thank you so much, Terry, for your willingness to moderate this evening, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Jen, and welcome everybody. We're so excited to have you and to share this tremendous group of panelists. I'll go ahead and start to introduce them as they pop onto the screen. It is my pleasure to first welcome Claude Motley. He's obviously the subject of the film. He was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Claude is a business and legal professional that works with the international law firm Motley Legal Services. He has been increasingly active in legal, social justice, and immigration cases while driving the conversation on reducing gun violence and inequality. We're so happy to have you, Claude. Thank you. And as well, we are so excited to have Vicki Adams here. She's also a film subject, and Victoria Davison Adams is a wife and mother of 3 boys, so very busy, who has worked in various roles in healthcare since 2003. And she's currently a student pursuing a Master's of Science in Nursing. Welcome, Vicki. We're so excited to have you. I'm excited to introduce the rest of our panelists as well. We have Debbie Kelly from Moms Demand Action. Debbie Minsky-Kelly is a volunteer with Moms Demand Action of Metro Milwaukee. Debbie is also a social work professor at Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where she teaches a semester course on the subject of psychological trauma. Debbie and I have never met before, but I have a feeling we have a lot in common about our perspective of things. Dr. Cassie Ferguson is an ED physician at Children's Wisconsin, and she's a wife and mother of 3 boys as well. She's an associate professor at MCW. She practices clinically in the emergency department, as I said, at Children's Wisconsin, and she directs the quality improvement and patient safety pathway at the medical school. And she is the associate director of the Kern Institute for the Transformation of Medical Education. Welcome, Cassie. Thank you for being here. We have 2 more panelists. We have Dr. Libby Schroeder. Libby Schroeder is a trauma surgeon at Froedert Hospital with a special interest in caring for gunshot wounds. Her interests include improving the long-term care of this patient population, both physically and mentally, as well as addressing the social determinants of health that contribute to high rates of gun violence in some of Milwaukee's neighborhoods. She lives in Whitefish Bay with her husband and 2 kids. And finally, we have Reggie Moore. Reggie serves as the Director of Violence Prevention, Policy and Engagement for the Comprehensive Injury Center at the Medical College of Wisconsin. He works tirelessly to advance the capacity of violence prevention policy and practice in Wisconsin and throughout the country. Prior to his current role, he led the City of Milwaukee's Office of Violence Prevention. He's an organizer at his core. Reggie has dedicated
So 2 technical issues. Terry froze on us and I forgot to unmute my mic. So thank you so much. We'll try to get going here. And thank you, Reggie, for being here tonight too. Hopefully Terry will rejoin us as she is prepared to moderate this conversation. But first and foremost, as she started at the beginning, thank you all so much for your willingness to participate tonight. Obviously, this film, When Claude Got Shot, is such an impactful and powerful story, one of violence and how it impacts the lives of the victims, the perpetrators, and the community surrounding them. As we begin to think about gun violence as it's depicted in this film and in our experiences in our communities more broadly, one of the questions is always, how do we conceptualize gun violence, and why might it be important to think about it as a public health crisis? Reggie, would you mind responding initially to that?
Sure. And good evening, and thank you for having me. And also deep appreciation for everyone who's joining online. When we often think about violence, we often think about a physical act, one person against another person. But when you think about the World Health Organization's definition, understanding that violence isn't just a physical act, it also is a threat. It can be psychological, it can be deprivation. All of these things can impact both individuals, families, and entire communities. There's a saying that there's nothing more violent than poverty. I would also say there's nothing more violent than policy. And unfortunately, when we think about violence, which we all have had some connection to, either knowing someone who's been harmed, whether personally or ourselves have been harmed, or even just understanding the level of violence that's happening in our world, it's something that's personal for all of us. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, the main response to violence has primarily been a criminal justice response. And so when you think about something as a public health issue, you understand that there are root causes and that the actual act of violence is often a manifestation of some form of unmet need or previous trauma. And I know that we'll talk about that a lot today, and I think that was underscored in the film. And so when you address something as a public health issue, it really is about understanding what are the conditions that actually create the risk for harm to occur. And what are the protective factors that should be in place that every child, that every family, that every neighborhood should have, and the types of resources that we know there are communities in our country, there are communities in our world where violence does not flourish. And so it's not rocket science to understand that if communities, families have what they need to thrive, not just survive, but to thrive, they're more likely to be safer communities. And so I think when we, really look at this holistically, the approach goes well beyond simply a criminal justice or law enforcement response. And it really is about everyone being involved. So Moms Demand Action, Bay Bridge, activists in Milwaukee, across the country, who understand that violence is preventable and we can do something about it on the front end.
Thanks for that, Reggie, and thanks, Jen, for taking over as I was dealing with internet issues. So I'm curious what other panelists think, and in particular, hospitals and healthcare systems have taken on a role in dealing and treating gun violence beyond what you see, Libby, and what you see, Cassie, in the hospital, but have gone beyond to address violence. Can you share what that looks like at your institutions?
Libby, do you want to start?
Sure. Sorry, I got to get my unmute myself. I think a lot of it is recognizing again that the way I've started to think about it is that a lot of the social determinants of health that my patients face are like their comorbidity, particularly the patients we typically see as gunshot wound victims are young, typically men, usually of color. And so often they don't, if you look at their chart, they don't have any other comorbidities. They don't have hypertension, coronary artery disease, and all of these other things that we think of. But what they have is a life history of chronic exposure to trauma, lack of access to education, safe housing, safe finances. And those are things that then can potentially lead to the reasons why they show up in our emergency room. And we know that victims of gun violence are upwards of 4 times more likely to be victims again. And so if we don't take care of them when we see them the first time and address those issues, it is very likely that they're going to be back in our trauma bay, being cared for us again. And with each of those incidents, their risk of having a fatal injury goes up. And so it's the entire way we then think about the way we care for these patients changes. And I think that's something we've seen as an evolution over the course of the last several years.
I would echo what Libby just said and just bring in a little bit of just some more understanding around maybe how this impacts kids or children that we see in the emergency department. I mean, I've taken care of too many kids like Nathan King. And I can tell you that nearly every one of my colleagues in the emergency department at Children's has cared for a child with a gunshot wound, only to see that same child, months or years later come back in with another gunshot wound, or sometimes a more severe one. And you start to go down this hole as a provider, you start to wonder if what you're doing matters. You start, what are we saving these kids and sending them back out into the same environment, and it does something to you, and suddenly saving their lives isn't good enough anymore. Like you have to do more. So I just want to make sure that everybody has a solid understanding of what this looks like in our emergency department. We treated 79 kids with gunshot wounds in 2020. That was an increase from over 160% from our highest year. 5 of those kids died in our hospital despite our best efforts. And that's the highest number of firearm deaths that we've ever seen. And when we compare ourselves to other pediatric trauma centers, we continue to see one of the highest firearm injury rates at Children's Wisconsin. When you look at what this does to kids, there's tons of data, and data specifically out of Chicago found that kids who took a test of cognitive skills right after an incident of violence in their neighborhood, just knowing that there was an incident of violence, they look like they missed 2 years of school compared to kids who took the same assessment just before an incident of violence, right? And this has been replicated in many, many studies. And this is not because, exposure to violence makes kids less intelligent. It's just occupying their mind. It makes them, they can't focus, they can't concentrate. It affects their school attendance, their sleep, their level of stress hormones, as many people on this call know. And so, some of the things that we've done at Children's, we certainly have focused on taking a trauma-informed approach to every single child, every family that we see in the emergency department and in our hospitals. We have a fantastic violence prevention program called Project Ujima that's run out of Children's Hospital. and really focuses on identifying kids who come to our hospital who've been victims of interpersonal violence and wrapping around them, wrapping around their families. And, just seeing that potentially we have the power to mitigate that psychological distress. But ultimately, public health issue demands prevention. And so I think that's really what we're hopeful for.
That's great. Thank you, Cassie, and thank you, Libby. And you can't help but be struck by the mental health impact that gun violence has in this film at so many levels for so many, for Claude and Vicky, how it impacted you both individually, but also your families, where you felt comfortable living. And so I wonder, what would it look like? And actually, I want to reflect on something Cassie said. Cassie, I loved the way you put it, Cassie, about the way in which violence occupies one's mind, right? And it really makes an individual attend to different things than what they need to be doing to thrive in life. And so that takes a lot away from them, right? And so I wonder, if we start with Claude, what would a community that is attending to the mental health of those exposed to violence look like? What would it look like to adequately address mental health of gun violence?
Well, I look at this situation where, I feel that the community of Milwaukee has dealt with so much violence throughout the years. This isn't something that's happened, recently. This is something that has built up. And when you get to that situation, with the constant gun violence, the constant crime, then the lack of trust we have in people that's supposed to protect you, say, for instance, the police department or criminal justice system, you get a level of PTSD. I think everyone has a level of PTSD that they have to deal with. You talked about occupying their brains. At that point in time, and I'm getting a lot of feedback, I'm sorry. At that point in time, you have a situation where you have to deal with, that PTSD, you have to deal with the actions. But one of the things that I would see from like a community of Whitefish Bay and how they might see it, but they don't have the direct effect of gun violence. They don't have the direct as much as somebody in Milwaukee, but they do have something that is a byproduct of gun violence, which I would say is apathy. And once you start to get into a situation of apathy, then at that point in time, you have a problem with being able to understand the situation. You stop focusing on the situation. Once you stop being able to understand the situation, then you will be vulnerable to actually believe different scenarios and things like that, in which you're going to be able to, you're going to not understand what actually is needed to help the problems that Reggie actually talked about, the needs and things of that sort. So when I look at solutions, I'm not a doctor or anything like that, but when I look at solutions of something like apathy, I would look at it as what Wellbeing told me, is in you would have to take these big tasks and break them down to small tasks. And the one thing that we can do is to try to get involved, and try to understand people. Once you start to try to get involved, then at that point in time, you start to heal not just the person that you're helping, but yourself.
Thank you for that, Claude. I loved what you said, because that involvement and getting involved is what helps to develop that understanding of others' lived experience, right? That's great. Vicky, I'm curious what your thoughts are about what would it look like for a community to adequately address the mental health of gun violence?
I think one of the things to adequately address gun violence is just, awareness. Having stricter gun laws, I think, would also be something that will be a major benefit. I think treatment, treatment needs to happen. The determinants of health, they need to be seriously considered before, when the police are called on someone. Those social determinants of health are very important because they do dictate sometimes how a person acts, their past, their environment, poverty, those different things that I will say in Whitefish Bay, they're not prevalent. They're not as prevalent, I should say, as Milwaukee, because in Whitefish Bay, we don't, like Claude said, we do deal with the byproduct of Milwaukee gun violence, but we don't deal with as much violence. So in order to combat, mental illness, PTSD, I think the biggest thing is treatment and awareness.
Yeah, and Vicky, to add to that, likely, access to treatment, right? Like making sure that the people that are in need of services actually have access to those services, which
Definitely
can be a huge barrier at times. Debbie, I'm curious your thoughts on this. You're a social worker, you teach trauma psychology course. What are your thoughts here?
Well, one thing that I just wanted to add to the great comments of others on the panel is that guns being involved in and so prevalent in communities, it's kind of like the gasoline on the fire of trauma, right? And so, and sometimes we have to think about how we're even conceptualizing trauma. So some people, almost everybody would agree like a sexual assault or a shooting is defined as a trauma. But what we're also finding is that kind of everyday exposure to adversities such as poverty, racism, living in fear because maybe you just don't think your neighborhood is safe. Even when you look at our diagnostic manuals, that type of trauma doesn't count. It's not defined. You can't get a diagnosis of PTSD from just these ongoing conditions that research has really shown have similar brain and body effects as traumatic events do. So oftentimes, particularly for children whose brains are still developing within communities where they are suffering many, many ongoing adversities, but they're being labeled instead with ADHD or other harmful diagnoses and not really being looked at through a trauma lens. And then you add the prevalence of guns. And one part of what we need in communities is to understand that children and teens are still experimenting, and that's normal. And they make impulsive decisions, and that's a normal part of development. But when you add guns into the mix, these normal developmental trials and tribulations become pathways towards incarceration and just the kids are not given opportunities to kind of make normal mistakes, and so it becomes so devastating for their entire lives. And one of the things that I think was so effective about the film was showing all of the ripple effects of how these one or two incidents literally rippled to impact hundreds of people because of firearms being involved. And when you think about the fact that every day in this country, 100 people are killed by guns and 200 are injured by guns. And if you think about all of those ripple effects and how it's, unequally distributed within communities, right? So in cities, we see much greater prevalence of these problems. And so the trauma is just, escalating throughout communities. And so we really need to understand this through a trauma lens and have communities where, there are safe spaces for kids to be kids and to be allowed to make mistakes that they can recover from.
Yeah, that's so well said, Debbie. And it makes me think about, if we look at prevention, we can't just think about preventing the immediate event or preventing bad things from happening after a firearm violence related event happens, but way upstream. Like, what is happening? Do people have access to food and safe housing and good education, accessible education, and ability to play and develop themselves, and all of the things that we want to have healthy lives. So all of those levels, it sounds like you all are, when we think about it as a public health approach to gun violence, it's all of those things across the lifespan. I want to shift gears a little bit here. And, you know, one of the things that struck me the most about the documentary was how it humanized the experience of gun violence in so many ways. You know, Claude, you even referenced this by talking, as you learned about the story of Nathan King, and you said that you experienced this humanization of what he went through as a youth. Sometimes as humans, we really like to fit things into a box or label them as good or bad, right? Like we could hear the story of what happened to you and think, well, he was a bad person for doing what he did. But the documentary really pulled out the complexity of his life and what led him down the path that he went down. It was easy, obviously, to access the empathy for you and Vicky and your families, but I couldn't help but notice the empathy I felt for him and his family as we learned more about his story too. And it really struck me as this idea that's talked about a lot, this idea of radical empathy. And it's this notion where we consider others' views and lived experiences so that we can connect and have a deeper understanding. And that's really where it ended, Claude, with you meeting him and really sitting down and talking to him about what happened and what he was doing and kind of where he is at that time. So I wonder, you know, how do you get to the point of having that capacity, Claude, to do that, to sit down with him and have this sense of empathy and let it kind of evolve as you learned more about him?
Well, you know, from the moment of the shooting, you know, I changed my thing. Can everybody hear me fine? Okay, great. From the moment of the shooting, one of the things that you will see in the film, and you have saw in the film, that, you know, I didn't want to misidentify him. You know, I was, you know, because the thing about it is that at one point in time, we understand about our, you know, our system that we live in. And, you know, you don't want a person labeled as, you know, to go into a system in which they're going to be labeled and it's going to affect the rest of their lives. And I knew at the time that he was a young kid. And so, you know, he's, you know, he's at around the same age as my son, you know. And so at that point in time, just by seeing the young boy, even though I was angry, I was also angry that this happened from a kid to do this to me, you know. And one of the things that I had to, you know, that I also started to understand is I started talking to my friends. I started, you know, when people came to see me and things like that, the anger and the fear that they all expressed because of the things that the lived experiences that they had over and over again. And a lot of them were even more angry than I was. And I'm the one that's the victim, you know, and I'm sitting here wondering, like, you know, what gets people to that point, you know, and that's when things that, you know, as I tell people all the time, it's a seed that was planted. When you talk about the empathy, I was a different person in the beginning of that film than I was at the end of that film. You know, I went through those 5 years and I grew and I got to understand different things because those seeds that were planted began to grow within me, you know. And so then as I'm going, I'm hearing these different stories. I know, you know, the doctors have talked about the increase, you know, when you talk about the increase of the shootings from one year to the next. I know it wasn't as many back in, you know, in 2014, but when you look at 444 shootings this past year, within the last 2 months, I've had a nephew and a good friend of mine shot. You know, this continues to go on and people continue to file away stories and actions within themselves that make them numb to the situation. And at that point in time, I realized that I had to do something to try to break this cycle of violence, try to bring some, you know, it's bigger than just me and Nathan. It's a situation that I wanted to reach out and let this story touch people to understand that this cycle has to be broken. So within that, and with knowing that, you know, I understood that I had to have compassion. I have to sacrifice something. Digging into your pockets and giving money is one sacrifice, but what can you sacrifice? And I sacrificed. I gave that anger up. I gave that, and I said, come on this journey. Let's go ahead and try to break this cycle. So that's it. It became something a lot easier as time went forward.
Claude, that's remarkable. To acknowledge that and then be able to do something with it to get to a more healing place. That's really remarkable. We have a question for Vicki, which was actually it looks like Benjamin posed this question. It was one of our original questions that we had listed, and it's a question I had too for Vicki, which is, you talk in the film about the racism that you faced when you moved to Whitefish Bay, but for you, it was a trade-off to have a safe family, for your boys to be safe where they were living and go out and use their bicycles finally. What are your thoughts now on that, and how you made that decision and balanced it?
It was definitely a difficult decision, considering that we owned our home. We had owned our home for several years, so it was a long, hard discussion before we decided that Whitefish Bay was the area that we would like to move to. One of the important factors were the school district there's great schools here in Whitefish Bay. So we considered that, and that really was one of the deciding factors. But we've now been in Whitefish Bay since 2014. So I can say that in the beginning, we did experience a lot of racism with getting pulled over, being asked where we were going, if we lived in the area, what we were doing in the area. I do think that has changed. And I think it has a lot to do too with getting to know the local police officers and them seeing you around and waving and having conversations. So that has changed. We have not experienced anything that we had experienced initially. We have not experienced that anymore. So I do think that it has been, after the first couple of years, it has been a pleasant experience living in Whitefish Bay.
That's great. That's wonderful to hear. I wonder too, I think about the patients that are brought in to either Froedert Hospital or Children's, and there's always stories, right, Cassie and Libby, about what happened. Going back to this question of how do you set aside maybe those stories to provide care to patients? How do you do that and resist that desire to kind of label people for the situations that they're in?
Well, I mean, I would say that the trauma bay is sort of the great equalizer, right? I mean, as a physician, I've taken an oath to care for everybody who shows up at my door. It doesn't matter who they are. And if I was a physician for Claude or for Nathan King when he was shot, I would care for him in the same way as I would care for any other child who came to me. When a kid comes in, I make it a point, I lean down so that I'm close to them so that they can see me. I look them in their eyes. I would tell him not to be scared, that he was safe, that we were going to take really good care of him. I call every single kid in my trauma bay sweetheart like I would my own child. In that moment, I mean, whatever they did, whatever they've done in the past, it's not my concern. I'm a physician. His life in that moment is my concern. And, I want to say this, and like I said, the trauma bay is this great equalizer in that there's this moment that one of the most difficult moments of my job is that space between, when a child dies and then their parent, particularly, I would say their mother's realization that their child's dead. And there's like this pause in that moment. Oftentimes, the family's in the trauma bay with us, and there's this moment and everybody just holds their breath And then there's just this, sound of a heart just shattering. And that, the sound of someone screaming after they've lost their kid is not something that you can let go of. That's what goes home with you. And, as a mom, and frankly, as a human being, I mean, it doesn't matter what neighborhood that kid's from or the role that they played to get into the emergency department. All that I can feel, and I imagine anybody in this situation, all that you can feel in that moment is just compassion and love for that person. I would say, struggle sometimes to sort of see my patients who are victims of violence in more than one dimension. And I think, again, we tend to keep them in our minds as victims. And I think that isn't fair to my patients or to their families. And one of one of my teachers in this area is this woman. She's a Buddhist nun. Her name's Pema Chodron. And she wrote this, which I've memorized because I've read it so many times. She wrote that compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. And only when we know our own darkness well can we sit with the darkness of others. So really, that compassion only becomes real. It's only authentic when you really recognize that you share humanity with your patients, right? We suffer, all of us suffer. Suffering is not a relative term, it's absolute. It doesn't matter, where you're coming from. And if you can see that, if you can be vulnerable enough to know your suffering, I think that helps me to become more connected to my patients and come from a place of that pure compassion and love, and not from pity, and just seeing them as a victim. But I'm still learning.
Yeah, I guess, I would just add on the adult side, there's the trauma bay piece of it. And I completely agree with Cassie. Everybody in the trauma bay is a patient. And, for the most part, we don't have time to hear the stories. And to be honest, I wouldn't want to hear them anyway, because usually they're not accurate anyway. And so everybody's a victim, and when they arrive. And then, there's also the pieces, a lot of these patients are then with us for days, weeks, months in the hospital. And it is always, they come in with their life experiences, particularly during COVID. A lot of them are not allowed to have families around, which means they are being cared for. They've gone through the most terrifying event in their life, and then they're completely alone. And they're being cared for by people that they don't know, that often don't look anything like them, that don't come from the neighborhoods that they come from. Sometimes there are police officers in their rooms, and they are then supposed to comply with our care plans. And, recognizing that they are scared, and sometimes their reactions to being scared or to say no to care, to potentially lash out. Again, all things, and I don't care if they're 8 or 28, in my mind, they're all kids. And so these kids act out because that's what kids do. And again, because they're scared, and then trying to meet them where they are and make them feel safe and let them know that we are there to care for them. And that is our only goal, both in terms of their physical and mental well-being, in order to get them better. And that can be really challenging at times, but also really, really rewarding. And I think we're lucky to be putting together a team of people who recognize that and want to put in the work, with the understanding that it's going to take a lot of work in order to be able to address all the needs of these patients above and beyond sewing up their holes, because that's the easy part.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up so many good points. There's a question that was posted about why was Claude shackled and handcuffed. And I know we've talked a lot about this, Libby and Reggie, and about those experiences in the hospital. And as you pointed out, Libby, that really, this person just went through this life-threatening experience. They survived, but there's still a lot of fear. And then all of a sudden you know, they're handcuffed and being investigated, and that really can impact the patients. I'm sure you see that a lot with the patients you treat.
We do, and you know, it's, if there's one thing I've learned in the last few years, particularly since arriving here and working in a place that has such a high volume of gunshot wound patients, the intersectionality between law and healthcare is this huge gray zone, and within that gray zone, we as a whole typically tend to err on the side of the law and not on the side of what's best for the patient. And I think largely in many ways because people think they are mutually exclusive. And, you know, there's ongoing work within our healthcare system to try and figure out a better way to do that, with the understanding that it's not black and white, and we can treat patients with dignity and respect and allow them to maintain their human rights while keeping our staff and the public safe. And those don't have to be an either or.
Well said. Very well said. Reggie, you know, one of the things that also struck me in watching this, I watched it a while ago, and then I got to watch it again yesterday, which was nice to see it again and see the story more deeply, I think. And, you know, I think a lot of people think that the gun violence happening in Milwaukee is gang related. But if we look at this story and what happened to Claude, it's not. So can you elaborate on what is at times the most of the root cause of the gun violence that we're seeing, and is that really gun or gang related, or is it related to something else?
Yeah, I can address it. There's like quite a few things I want to address actually from the last 5 minutes of conversation. In terms of the short answer to your question, most of the violence, particularly gun-related violence that we see, is very interpersonal. It's, you know, friends, acquaintances, family members. In terms of robberies, which is what occurred in both cases here, in terms of random acts of gun violence, are less common than the types of gun violence that's, you know, flooding the Trauma's Bay, both at Children's and at Froedert, where it's a lot of conflict, it's a lot of retaliation. You know, since the pandemic, there has been a significant increase in gun purchases. So you have a heck of a lot more guns that are accessible at points of conflict, whether we're talking road rage, whether we're talking domestic violence, or just an argument between an uncle and a cousin, that people will grab a firearm, and then when you mix any kind of substance, whether it be alcohol or drugs, into that situation, it's extremely volatile. We've also seen an increase in accidental shootings in terms of children having access to firearms that are unsecured. And so all of these things, I think, are factors that drive the gun violence that we see. And one of the things I think is really powerful about this story and this documentary is that oftentimes we pay attention, understandably, to the homicides that occur. We had over 800 non-fatal shootings in the city last year. And I think there's not an appreciation of the impact of what it means to survive a gunshot wound. And as a Black man who, you know, born and raised in Milwaukee, I have been shot at. The first time that I had a gun held to my face was actually in an alley in Chicago at 12, where I was held up at gunpoint. And so as Black men in this city, your sort of experience with gun violence often will occur early, and unfortunately may be repeated throughout your life. And, you know, one of the things that I say often is people should not have to leave this community to feel safe. And at funerals, when people say, you know, this child is now resting in peace or finally has peace, children shouldn't have to die to find peace in this world. And so I just want to underscore that regardless of the source of the gun violence or what's causing it, it should be unacceptable to all of us, and doing everything possible to stop it on the front end.
Thank you for that, Reggie. And thank you for sharing your story too. There was a question posed in the chat, a couple actually. One of them was about Claude, when you met with Nathan and it was divulged to you that he kind of saw you in this father figure, you know, what was that like to hear that? And then also there was a question about whether the two of you stay in touch.
You know, that obviously, you know, and I hope I saw it in the movie, I was kind of shocked, you know, but I wasn't surprised, because the thing about it is that I think that one of the things that we do misunderstand is that a lot of these kids are looking for a connection. They're looking for someone to reach out to. You know, they don't want to be driving themselves, because the thing about it is that when you're just, you know, just from my personal experience, you know, you have a situation in which um, you, the things that happen in the city can make you feel hopeless. And if you don't have anybody guiding you out of that situation, anybody that's been there before, uh, you know, you spin out of control. So when someone says something like that to when Janine said that to me, I was kind of like, I understand. You know, it is very understandable. And once again, I say this all the time. I have a son, I have nephews and nieces that are the same age as him and around that age, and they feel the same way. You can tell that when they listen to you, they're really holding on to it. But at one point in time, you know, I think that we became powerless in the situation of guiding our children and things like that. But that's a whole nother story. As for keeping, I have not been able to since that time talk to him. You know, one of the things that I understand that, you know, he's doing time in a very hard place. You know, and yeah, I'm open to it. You know, but I just feel that he has things that he has to deal with, and it's hard enough to be in that situation. So I wouldn't want to put that on him, but you know, hopefully he understands that, you know, I have given up the anger, and I just hope that he can understand that he doesn't owe me anything. I just want him to be successful within his own self. So that's one of the things that I'm happy that I was able to express to him, and hopefully one day we can, you know, talk about things, and maybe I can help him in the future.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Claude.
That's great. Thank you, Claude.
There's another question here about if you and Vicky explain how you've coped with your trauma and how it's still affecting you today.
For me, coping was very difficult. I suffered from PTSD. I actually got a therapist that I was seeing weekly, every 2 weeks for quite some time. It affected my career because I worked in a hospital, and at this hospital that I worked at, we did have a lot of inmates that would come to the hospital, and it was very hard for me to separate those patients from Nathan, because in my mind they were kind of all the same. So it affected several different aspects of my life. So I think until I got therapy, it was still, you know, something tough for me to deal with. Now to this day, I still carry my firearm. Like that was the case back then, and that is still the case now, because I felt like it did save my life, and I don't want to be put in a position like that again. So it's sad to say that you have to feel that way. You shouldn't have to feel that way. You shouldn't have to feel like you have to have a firearm to feel protected and feel safe. But I don't think that will change probably for me, just because I did experience that trauma, but it gets better over time. I can say that coping gets easier over time.
Yeah. And it almost seems to be, there was a point in the movie, Claude, when you were talking with your sister and your father on the porch. And I think it was your sister who talked about, we're not really free, because of the realization that you were out, you know, having a school reunion and dropping your friend off. And that should have been something that that should have been a safe thing. And so the impact that that had on your own personal freedom, and it really goes back to what Reggie was talking about too, about creating healthy and safe communities. It's hard to do that, I would imagine, when there's not that sense of feeling free. How are you coping now?
You know, being a male, I guess I'm my standard words are I'm doing okay. I'm okay, you know, but you know, obviously one of the things that helped me is being able to talk about this, being able to be expressive and to explore the deeper parts of what the meaning of what happened to me, you know, what it meant to me and how and to express that. But I mean, the thing about it is that one of the things that we understand about PTSD, we don't know when that hits. We don't know how that affects them until you're able to sit down and to look into it. And so, you know, I'm still going through my path. I still have to find my way through this thing, you know, because it affects you. And but you know, like I said, it's I was very glad to be able to do something and what Reggie expressed. You know, luckily this is one story out of thousands. And when you think about that, thousands of people are not able to actually express and show and give their story out to the world. So I feel lucky to be able to do that. But we cannot forget the thousands of other people that are suffering. And when we talk about suffering, we're talking about a ripple effect that goes through not only the person and the victim, also the families and the communities. It's a ripple effect that continues to go. So, you know, I'm okay, but you know, we all got to understand that we have a lot of work to do when it comes down to dealing with mental illness within our community.
Yeah.
And I would like Reggie to say something about, you know, what he thinks about Victoria, you know, saying about the thing, you know, still needing her gun and things like that. I mean, I think that it's a valid situation when you talk about the community and how people feel about, you know, the conflict of the safety thing.
Yeah, I mean, from a street perspective, and I definitely want to talk more about the Forum for Life program, and we have a team of violence interrupters, many of which, you know, have come from the streets and continue to have very strong relationships to be able to mediate and intervene and de-escalate conflicts in the city. So we have a very clear understanding of what's happening and the level of violence that's happening and how it's impacting, you know, families whose homes have been shot up repeatedly because one, you know, group or a set of individuals are trying to retaliate or attack, you know, another individual. And so if they can't get to that individual, they try to attack, you know, the mom or the grandmother or someone else in that home. And we've also seen an increase in terms of the number of women and children who have been shot. And so, you know, back in the day, there was a code in the street that women and children were off limits. And unfortunately, that code is no longer exists. And, you know, there was actually a study that was funded by the Joyce Foundation in Chicago of teenagers who carried firearms. And what they found was over 98% of them carry firearms not to commit an offense or even plan or intend to commit an offense, but out of fear and out of protection, and because they were afraid that they would be robbed or they would be attacked, or girls felt like they may be assaulted standing on the bus stop or coming from work at night. And so those are all things that affected their attitudes and behaviors around firearm possession and the necessity of it. And even when you look at the concealed carry classes, when that was launched, the majority of participants were women who purchased, you know, firearms for home protection, et cetera. Unfortunately, gun safety is not taught in those classes. How to handle a firearm, how to store a firearm safely, all of that is not taught in that class. And people that we've talked to in the community who took those courses thought that it would be. And so, you know, when you look at some of the proposals at the state level that are being proposed to try to lower the age for concealed carry, to have firearms stored in vehicles near schools, we're going backwards. We're going in the absolute wrong direction. And at the end of the day, you know, we have to work towards building a community where people don't feel, you know, that level of threat that a firearm is necessary. And so, And I wanted to address, there was a question asked about the intersection of racism, gun violence, and it goes back to Claude, something you talked about in terms of not wanting to misidentify, Nathan. And you think about the systemic and structural violence, that the systems that we have to rely on to either serve, protect, or heal can oftentimes re-victimize. And, when we think about gun violence and retaliation, where people want to take justice into their own hands. And we see that as a driving factor because people may not trust the system. There's a declining, not just among, folks of color, but global, nationally, there's a decline in trust in government and public systems. And so these are all things that we have to be cognizant of and really think about, how do we address so that people actually are served with dignity, with respect, whether we're talking a hospital, whether we're talking law enforcement response, that people should be able to rely on public services to not re-victimize or re-traumatize. Terry, you might be muted. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Terry, if you don't mind, can I talk about Forum for Life for a quick second? So for folks who don't know, Forum for Life is a violence interruption program of the Office of Violence Prevention with the city of Milwaukee. And this year they partnered with the Medical College of Wisconsin Comprehensive Injury Center to be the implementation partner of the program. So the team is actually housed within our Division of Violence Prevention within the Comprehensive Injury Center. And since the program launched in 2018, there's been over 150 mediations that could have led to gun violence, whether a homicide or non-fatal shooting, and over or close to 800 gunshot survivors have been referred to the program, primarily patients who've been seen at Froedert Hospital. And so I know that both Libby and Terry can speak to that, but the time to really intervene or connect with an individual who's been shot, being able to have that partnership with Froedert, the only adult level 1 trauma center, very similar to the program of Project Ujima at Children's, being able to engage with that survivor and their family in that hospital room is critically important, because those minutes are where the anger, the rage, and the plans for retaliation begin. And so being able to provide that comfort to a family, to be able to triage and support that family in the hospital as a part of the care team, while at the same time on the street side, being able to connect with friends and other family members to, again, try to prevent retaliation is significantly important. And so just seeing the work, I just want to shout out, Derek Rogers, who's the program director, Ray Mendoza, Steve Hopkins, and Tania Liddell, who's the main hospital responder, do life-saving work every day in this city. And so when we talk about solutions and things that can work, just understand that things could be a lot worse. And I know it's hard to believe that with 800 shootings in the city, but just know that there are people in the community doing everything possible to address this issue.
Reggie, there's a follow-up question to that, which is, how does Forum for Life engage with other organizations, or especially those that are engaging in advocacy, to further their work?
Right. That is a great opportunity to shout out, Brady, WAVE, Moms Demand Action, many of the groups that, are advocating at the state and national level. I mean, even when you think about the investment that the Biden administration has committed to violence prevention, that came about because of advocacy and demanding that we do something and treat gun violence with the same level of urgency and concern that we responded to with COVID. And so, and understanding that this has been a pandemic for a very long time in our country. And so in terms of partnerships with Safe and Sound and, Community Task Force and grassroots organizations, the Healthcare Partnership, there's a lot of organizations that the program works with, receives referrals from, and tries to be responsive to, again, mediate whenever possible before a gun is ever drawn or a shot is ever fired.
Yeah, thanks for that, Reggie. It takes that coordination, right? And all of those organizations coming together. Debbie, I wonder about Moms Demand Action and the perception on the bill that was just passed. in Wisconsin to lower the gun age for conceal and carry?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So Moms Demand Action really focuses on keeping guns out of the hands of people that should not have them. And, minors or, young people whose brains are not fully developed, that would certainly be a category that, we would not want guns in those hands. We want to be sure that there's a background check on every gun sale, that families have tools if they have a loved one who they know is in a mental health crisis or in a domestic violence situation, to have ways to get guns away from domestic abusers. As Reggie talked about, many of these incidents of gun violence are within close family or relationship networks and issues of conflict that are being resolved, in quotation marks, through the most violent means. And so we would support red flag laws that would allow temporary removal of firearms from situations that are known to be very volatile. And so, those are the types of policies, our organization, works with legislators to advocate for these policies that are supported by 80 to 90% of voters. But it's the gun lobby that continues to pull their weight over our elected leaders to prevent these types of policies from being enacted. So if there's people on this call that want to take action, we also advocate for increased state funding for community-based organizations like 414 Life. So if people on this call want to take action, donate to 414 Life, join Moms Demand Action for gun safety in America. We are the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country. You don't have to be a mom. You just have to have a mom. That's what we like to say. Anybody who has a mom can join Moms Demand Action.
Thank you, Debbie. And thank you for talking us through those different ways in which things can change, right? And where action can be taken at the policy level. There's a comment in the chat that we definitely want to call out, and it's this question about how can the media rethink the way that they're reporting on shootings? And I'm curious what the panelists think about that.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, and particularly as we, this being sponsored by Bay Bridge and many of us living in Whitefish Bay, I think it is so easy to try and make this about others and the othering of gun violence, particularly in communities like ours. I can remember having a conversation last summer with somebody who lives around here about a shooting that had gone on that day at work that had happened on Silver Spring, right just west of 43. And the person who was, from this neighborhood kept saying to me over and over again, well, that's a really long mile. That's a really long mile. And I think we have to stop thinking about it that way. I think we need to make that mile shorter and shorter and recognize that those are our neighbors that live on the same street we do, just a little bit farther west. And that the stories that they have and the things that are impacting their day-to-day lives should hit us at our core. And I agree with Benjamin when he says, as a TV reporter, we all turn on the news now and it's another shooting, another shooting, another shooting. And just taking a deep breath and remembering that is somebody's son, brother, friend, father, daughter, mother, sister. And really just trying to put yourself in the other shoes, because we are all a community. And then the other thing I just want to speak on, particularly, and this was featured in the film with Victoria, is for those of us that are here, there's been all sorts of talk about anti-racism over the last, particularly 2 years, and it's become a dirty word. And nobody wants to be a racist. We all strive to not be, but particularly in a community like this, that in many ways we look pretty homogenous, that when you see something and it takes you aback a little, just take a deep breath and think through why you're having that reaction and accept it as part of, I mean, it's been shown it's a bit of human nature. It's ingrained in us. And rather than denying that it's there, recognize that it's part of who we are, and then figure out what you have to do in order to change that being your initial impulse. Because we can all do better at that, regardless of which neighborhood we're coming from and what our background is.
Well said, Libby. Thank you for that.
I'd also just want to pop in here. Then I think it's also important that those of us that are living in Milwaukee suburbs to really remember how suburbs were created. It's not an accident that we are a segregated city. I mean, there were real financial investments made in moving people out of the central city all over the country, but certainly in Milwaukee. And what that meant for the people who literally couldn't move out of the city because of housing covenants that wouldn't allow, people in the suburbs to sell their homes to anybody who wasn't white. And all of that money that was taken out of the central city means, it means something. It means that the infrastructure in the central city is, it's not as good. Schools aren't funded the same way. There's just, we forget about that and what that did to sort of allow people who live in the suburbs to see themselves as separate, like Libby was saying. That it basically allowed us to other everybody else and say it's their problem. And that's something that we have to own. It was surprising to me that in this last couple of years that there would be people who would live in Whitefish Bay and deny the presence of racism in our suburb. And so I think, in recognizing how this happened, we then have to also recognize that racism is ingrained in every single institution, and we're no better than anybody else.
So thank you for that, Cassie. And, Libby talked about really being able to be reflective about one's own responses in situations and honest with themselves, and using that few seconds to think about maybe responding differently in certain situations, or at least recognizing and acknowledging one's inherent biases. What other ways do you think that communities that are those suburban communities of Milwaukee can be more welcoming communities for others?
Just one of my thoughts on it, it's very hard to, from the inside looking outside, to really understand, why we're in such a situation, and we got to understand that, just like you were all talking about the covenants and things like that, all these fears and things have been layered upon each other that has, allowed us to get into what I will call almost, we look at Milwaukee, almost an open air prison, where a lot of people from Milwaukee are even scared to drive outside of the city limits because of the situation in which they're going to be asked or pulled over or things like that. And so they are stuck in that situation. So, when you talk about welcoming, one of the things that all the suburbs have to do, and all the, people that do not have an understanding of what's actually going on, and try to put that barrier, and try to put a situation in which they do not want to reach in, and so they have to overcome that. They have to try to understand. And I think the understanding goes both ways. It is not just a situation in where, we're just saying you all have to do it. Everybody, the community has to start thinking about how to come together. But as I said earlier, there's a sacrifice. Everyone has to give a little bit. You can't continue to hold on to yours and thinking that someone is going to give you something. So there has to be an understanding. So when I look at welcoming, we're talking about rules, laws, things like that has to be appreciated. These laws have to be created so it's not excluding, and then you have the norms, things that are learned, and that's where we have to start increasing our norms and our decorum, in which we can learn to live with each other and things like that. So it's we all know these things, but it's a matter of us starting to act, and I think that's where we have to really start thinking about how we're going to act.
Claude, I can't help but think that the way in which you talk about giving up something of yourself in order to understand someone else, and for you, that was the anger in the film, and using that as a way to really think about how we connect with others. I think that's just a beautiful way to recognize that in order to create this we community, we do need to give up a bit of ourselves, but to grow beyond who we are right now. And that's really what you highlighted, the growth that you've had since this happened. So thank you for sharing that. I can't help but think also what others might think about what we can do to further our understanding of the gun violence that's happening in Milwaukee. Because it seems like the theme here is that once we sit down and listen to each other and listen to each other's lived experience, it creates a level of empathy and compassion and understanding that can push us past certain barriers that we might have implicitly. And so what are other ways that people in this panel think that people listening could get involved to kind of understand even more about the experiences of those who live with gun violence on a daily basis or have been survivors of gun violence?
And I mean, my first plug would be definitely to listen to the Precious Lives series. And Brad can correct me if I'm wrong, and Santana, if that's still accessible. But that was a very powerful series that told, I believe, 100 stories of individuals that have been impacted by gun violence or folks working to end gun violence in Milwaukee. And those stories are extremely powerful and profound. And I think would give a very, deep picture about what's happening, the impact that it has, on families, on communities, and again, the efforts that some of the efforts that are happening to combat it. I think following and paying attention to not just the news in terms of the violence that has occurred, but also the policy violence that is occurring. And so, as Cassie, pointed out in terms of redlining and historical, policies that inflicted violence on communities, there are policies that are also, being proposed and advanced as well on a daily basis that, again, people need to pay attention to and speak out about, and making sure that, we're not just sitting in silence as injustices are happening, whether it's in a state house or in a local community. And then the last thing I want to say is that, violence, injustice, racism don't really stand up well to contact and connection. What I mean by that, and when we talk about communities are made up of people, systems are made up of people. And oftentimes, if you look at your social media and all of your friends look like you, if you look at where you hang out, where you shop, where you live, and that community is not diverse, or you don't have relationships, not just at work, but in your personal life with people different from you, that's a very important and simple step I think that folks can take, is to really have genuine connection and relationships to folks. I think our young people, quite frankly, are dying from a lack of connection. And I think the documentary underscored that in the connection that he saw in you, Claude. And I know, many young men in our community who are looking for that same connection. And so if you are not a mentor, if you are not volunteering with organizations like Running Rebels or Urban Underground or any other, youth program in the city, those are our Mentor Milwaukee or Mentor MKE, which is in partnership with Milwaukee Bucks, are all efforts that you can get involved. So again, I would encourage people to pay attention to policy, make personal efforts and sacrifices in your own life to have connections with people different from you, and continue to speak out and be an advocate and serve.
Thank you, Reggie. And if anybody knows, there was a question about where to find the Precious Lives series. If they could put it in the chat if the panel members don't know. It was a very powerful series. Oh, and it is still available. Thank you. Other thoughts?
I'd also just remind everybody that it's an election year in case you didn't remember. We all get to gear back up, and I know we're all sick of hearing about it, but there's some really important things on the line in Wisconsin in particular, some very important seats. And the more you can get involved at all levels, whether it's financial or advocacy, we got to do better.
It's another point of action, right, Libby? Action that we can take. Absolutely.
And on that note, Moms Demand Action does give a designation to candidates in either party that support gun sense legislation. And so that is something, to consider in the upcoming election cycle.
And it looks like there's some resources in the chat for those that are interested in finding out more information from Guns Demand Action, or for Moms Demand Action, excuse me, on gun policy. Okay, well, I'm going to kick it back over to Jen to finish us off.
All right. I can't believe that an hour and a half has passed already in this conversation tonight. Thank you all sincerely. Thanks to each of our panelists, Claude, Vicki, Reggie, Libby, Cassie, and Debbie. Thank you so much for sharing your truths and your stories and allowing us to learn yet again from your experiences, Vicki and Claude, and the wisdom gained from that. This was a sincere privilege for me to be able to work with y'all to pull this together, and I can't express my appreciation enough. I also want to thank all of our attendees tonight. We had hoped to have 50 people sign up for this, and our final registration was over 400. That's good for my soul. It's so encouraging to have such a large group of community members interested in learning about the impact of gun violence. And just to highlight a couple of things, a couple of ways we can take this learning and move toward action. I do want to highlight, consider joining Moms Demand Action. As Debbie said, even those of you who don't identify as a mom, it's okay. You can still take action and work towards that. You can join through the website, Moms Demand Action, all one word, .org, or by texting READY, READY, to 64433. And Moms Demand Action is having, again, that virtually a virtual day of action on February 12th. So look for information on that. Also, wanted to shout out to Milwaukee Film again. Consider attending, joining the organization. They host conversations like this in their film festivals all the time and are putting out and making films like When Claude Got Shot accessible to all of us. Consider attending their Black History Month events coming up. Information about that is at mkefilm.org. Shameless plug, consider joining Bay Bridge, especially those of you who are logged on from Whitefish Bay. We've got a lot of work to do, not just in Milwaukee specifically, but in our suburbs, in our broader communities, in our state, in our country. And we can start locally and build those connections with each other and learn from each other and grow with each other. You can sign up for our newsletter. And information is at baybridgewisconsin.org. We are also hosting another virtual session on April 27th entitled Mapping Racism and Resistance, Struggles Over Racism and Real Estate in the Urban North, about the redlining comments that Cassie highlighted for us today too. That'll be hosted or led by Reggie Jackson from Nurturing Diversity Partners, Ann Bonds at UWM, Derek Handley at UWM, and Lawrence Hoffman from Groundworks. For those of you unable to watch the film prior to tonight, When Claude Got Shot will be screened at the New Jersey Film Festival on February 5. You can pre-register at New Jersey Film Festival Spring 2022. And it's right, you'll see the same picture that we used for our event tonight at the bottom of the screen. Click on it and you can pre-register to watch the film there. The film will also be shown on PBS locally on May 9th, 2022. Thank you again, all of our panelists and our participants for tonight. Don't worry if you've missed details. We're going to send you all a long email with a lot of information at the end of this anyway. So keep a lookout in your inboxes for that. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening. And Vicki, let's grab a coffee down the street.
Anytime.
Sounds good.
Thank you.